Okay, so we're going to dive right into it because I know, again, that y'all are super busy and you want to get to the information. And while we start this out, I am really curious. I know a few of you did fill out my pre-survey, and thank you so much. And just type in the chat box, what is your biggest concern? What is your biggest challenge that you're thinking about while we get this kick started? And that way we can make sure by the end of our talk, at least we can ask or answer some of your direct concerns and challenges, and we will have an opportunity for a Q&A. So if you want to ask either myself or Veronica, live, we'll do our best to answer that for you if we're able to give you a direct answer. And if we have to follow up with you, we'll be sure to let you know that too. But if you have any, like, oh, I definitely want to make sure we hit this topic, we talk about this, throw it in the chat box. And I won't answer it right now because we want to get through our roadmap, but I will make sure we at least touch base on it before we hit the Q&A. Okay, and so as we have people coming in, I'm just going to go ahead and mute all of y'all just to keep some of the background noise. I know I got some background noise here, and I appreciate y'all's patience. But when Veronica and I were talking about, what do we want to talk about? What are really the five highlight points? And honestly, it was kind of hard for us to narrow it down because every time we started talking about one, we're like, oh man, that could be a whole session on its own. And so this is meant to be a relatively high view. Think of this like as an umbrella of everything to think about. And we're going to hit those points of like where you'd want to go through. So that way you can see the big picture. Because I know sometimes it can be really hard to say, how do I get started? How do I get going when you don't really understand what is that ultimate picture that you're aiming for? But when you can see the whole map of, this is the process I need to think through, walk through, it makes things so much easier because some of the biggest problems, and I'm sure Veronica's had the same, I've noticed from the land management side is you try to do everything at once. You're like, I want wildlife, I want timber income, I want to be able to enjoy it, I want to have my home site out here. You want it all and you want it all now versus being able to say, these are my priorities and these are the steps I'm going to get there. And the succession idea is going to be the exact same way. You can have all these different thoughts and ideas, but we need to prioritize it. We need to kind of put it in order. And that's what this is going to do for you, give you that umbrella, high level roadmap view to help you walk through a lot more of those details and conversations. So I'm going to be uploading the roadmap for those that joined a little late in the succession conversation starter. So if you just keep seeing that pop in the chat box, it's because people are joining us live. And I know you can't see history in the chat, so I just want to make sure they can see it. But to open up, starting point number one that we decided was you really have to get clear on goals and values. And so, Veronica, I kind of just teased it a little bit with the land, but start with like goals and values. And, like, how do you look at that question of what do you want from the legal side?
Yeah, for me, it's always it's the first question. Whenever someone comes to me when they're talking about estate planning, heirs property, probate, whatever it is, I ask them, what are your goals? What do you want to accomplish? Because it's very easy for me as a lawyer to be like, okay, someone's coming to me, they have heirs property. I need to talk to them about A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And I need to make sure they do A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And they might have an idea of really, I just need a reliable place that I can stay and raise my family. That's their ultimate goal. But I'm thinking of, okay, we gotta clear the title. We gotta get it this and there. So I always start with what are your goals for this property, for this process? What are your goals with working with me as a potential attorney that you'd be hiring? Because a lot it's very easy to go off into the weeds, and so you want to make sure you're very clear. And I always, when I work with clients, I take note of their goals, and then I make sure that throughout the time I'm representing them, that I'm reminding them and myself of the goals because it keeps us anchored. When we just have like no goals or we just kind of like trying to do everything at once, we go in all different directions. But when we have our goals very clearly stated, then it keeps us on track. And I know that one thing that Danielle and I talked about was how when you're looking at land legacy planning. You might think, well, of course, I want to make sure I have a plan in place to leave my land to my children. But if you go a little deeper, you realize, well, me and my children might have a very different idea of what that looks like. My goal is to just get it to my children so that they can keep the land and do exactly as I was doing. But their goal might be that they want to figure out how they can get money to be able to do something that they're passionate about that might be totally unrelated to the land. So it's important from a legal perspective that you're thinking, what do I want to accomplish with this? Do I want to do something based on my values and my expectations, or do I want to make this something where I'm helping my children, or even it could be my community, it could be my neighbors. I'm helping the environment. Whatever it is that you are wanting to accomplish, making sure that your plan helps you to accomplish those goals and not just having a plan. And one more thing I'll say on that before I finish my spiel on this is that this is why it's important to work with a lawyer on your estate plan. Because if you just say, okay, I know that I am going to die one day and I need to get a will in place, and you just go online and you find a place where you can get a fill in the blank will, then that will document is not going to ask you what are your goals. And so you might think, oh, I got me a will in place, I got everything good. But then it doesn't really accomplish what you're trying to accomplish. When you talk to a real human, we can say, hey, had you thought about this? Had you thought about that? And then we can help you come up with a plan that's customized and that actually accomplishes what you're setting out to do.
Yeah, 100%. And it's probably going to sound like we're going to harp on this a little bit more than you want to. But this point right here, your goals, your values, and prioritizing them, which is the same of every time I talk on the land. What are your goals? What are your values? Because you can't hit all things. You have to prioritize. Because otherwise you're never going to thrive. But we're harping on this because this is the foundation. If you can get super crystal clear on this, have that deep self-reflection, everything else will be easier because land and succession is super emotional. And that's okay. It should be emotional. However, the decisions you want to make, we want to remove the emotion out of this completely. We want to look at this as almost a business transaction, which is going to sound harsh and it's going to sound honestly rude, but that's what we need to do to make sure we're making the wisest decisions. And so your goals and your values is where your emotions are going to be, but this is also where we're going to keep them. And if you cannot really get this solid and like good footing, everything else is going to be like, oh, I could do this, I could do that, and you're going to get swayed. And honestly, it reminds me a lot of the scriptural parable where Jesus talks about building on rock or sand. When you don't have that solid foundation, like he talks about the man who didn't listen to the words and built his house on the sand because he wanted it done quick, he wanted it done his way. He didn't listen to the wisdom. The first storm came and blew everything over. And so that's kind of like what Veronica was saying about just getting a will online and feeling like you've checked off the box, not prioritizing your goals. As soon as one hiccup comes, everything's going to come tumbling down. And that can look different ways. It can be everything tumbling down through the estate planning probate process. It could be come tumbling down through the family relationships or the actual what's done on the land. And so, some things for you to think about, and I would challenge you because goals and values is still a really abstract way to talk about it. Is I would say, think about what is most important to you, okay? And I'm going to give some examples to help you, and I'll let Veronica pin this in, and then we'll move on to the rest of the roadmap. But like I said, this is really important, and I like to harp on this. We got environmental, okay? So like I want to be a good steward. I want to do right by the land. I want to make sure the land stays in trees and forested and not developed, right? That's a hard value. That's a hard goal. We also have family relationships. I want to make sure my family keeps a solid, good relationship, that nothing divides my kids, sibling relationship, my relationship with my kids. That's a hard value. That's a hard goal. Sometimes the land side and the family side don't always meet hand in hand because we also have to remove a lot of our rose colored glasses and be honest with what do our kids want, what are they looking at, and sometimes they don't meet eye to eye. And that's where that does selling the land make the right decision for you kind of come into play because you again have to decide what is most important: family values, environmental stewardship. What was the other one we had talked about, Veronica? I think we had talked about something else in terms of goals and values. but I can't
Hmm.
remember it off the
I
top
don't
of
know
my
if
head.
it's like just balancing the present versus the future, making sure
Yes.
that yeah, I'll let you take it.
And so like looking at what it is now versus, which I guess it ties in a little bit more into the environmental. And so some people were like, oh, I'm going to throw an easement out there on it and then I'm going to pass it down. But then by doing that, you might restrict opportunities. Oh, generational wealth. That's how that tied in. I want to ensure that my land, my asset helps create generational wealth, right? We want to look at that as that's what we want to pass on. That's important to us to allow them the financial freedom to do whatever their dreams are. Now, this is important again, so I'm just giving like three tiers, and there might be another tier that comes to your mind. And if there is, throw it in the chat. I'd love to see what that is. But these three tiers are very distinct, right? And there's different ways to get to them. But once you've decided what is your priority, the rest of the decisions after this are going to be easier, okay? And this is also where you're going to have to be, again, really honest with how are your family dynamics? What are your children's goals? What are your goals? What are their relationships like? You don't want to say, just for example, I want to keep my kids' relationships really solid. And right now, they don't have a good relationship. So, passing land to siblings who don't agree on anything right now is honestly probably the worst thing you could do for them. It's only going to divide them further, right? It's much easier to divide money numbers to prevent them from fighting even further than it is to pass down land. Or even if you divide the acreage, that's another option for you. But this is where, again, you have to decide what those values are and being honest. And so those were just a few examples. So I know I want to make sure we get through all of the roadmap. If you have any questions about goals, throw that in the chat box before we move on and you might forget. Or write it out on your notebook and you can be sure to ask that. But do you have anything else, Veronica, on goals and values that you want to make sure we hit before we move on?
The thing that came to mind was like, don't assume anything. Always ask because you might think it's obvious to the other person that you're thinking about, but it's not. And so you always need to ask. I thought about that with the generational wealth perspective. That's a place where I often have to remember that it's my clients' values and goals and not mine because I'm always about having helping people to preserve generational wealth, transfer it to the next generation. But all of my clients, that's not their focus. Some of them are like, look, I sent them to school. I educated my kids. They got everything they need to be successful. I'm not trying to pass them anything. Whatever they get is going to be what they get on their own. So what they want to pass on is they want to make sure that this land is protected because they're concerned about their children having food to eat in the future. And they know if I give this land to my kids, and they're gonna sell it, and they're gonna sell it to the highest bidder, whether that's a subdivision developer or a farmer. They're looking at who's giving them the most money. But I know they're gonna need some food, so I'm gonna sell my land to a farmer, or I'm gonna give my land to a conservation agency because I'm looking at the ecological perspective or the food access perspective. And so it's with the generational wealth situation. A lot of times you might have that as a concern. Your children may not be concerned, or vice versa. Your children might be looking for the wealth you want to send to them, but you're looking at, I need to make sure this land is available to whoever is going to be the best steward of it. So that was something I just wanted to add on that.
Yeah, and another option could be family heritage. That was another one we had talked about, preserving family history. And that can be really important to you. But again, making sure there's someone in the family that's just as important too, right? And so there's a whole lot of ways you can go through preserving family heritage, right? And even passing it on to another family. And a lot of times, and I talk about this in the selling land aspect to again remove some of the emotions around it, is if your kids live really far away, they may look at generational opportunities as how can I start something closer to me that I can utilize a lot more? Or they may say, I'm definitely traveling back every single time because if they have that family heritage importance to them too, that is worth it to them. But that's where that communication comes. And like where we're at right now in Alabama, this is 6 hours away from us. 6 hours isn't nearly as far as a lot of landowners' properties that I've worked with. However, it's far enough that we don't really get a chance to come over here, except like Thanksgiving. Now that the kids are getting older, hopefully we will. But this family farm has been in my husband's side of the family since the 1800s. So that family heritage is really important to him. Um, And so, how do you weigh that with how do you look at the future? And so, I'm also just in the middle of these discussions within our own family. I'm right there in the same boat with y'all. But I know we have the rest of the roadmap. I hope I've emphasized really well that if you can line this up, I promise you the rest of what we're about to talk about isn't going to be like light switch easy. However, it will be a lot more clear. And even if it's still hard, you'll be more confident that this is the right way to go versus getting swayed back and forth. So, roadmap item number two is ownership structure. And honestly, I don't know about you, Veronica, but this is the one I get asked about the most. Like, should I pass it to my kids? Or more so, they'll say, I just want to pass it equally to my kids. I want to make sure I'm fair to all of the kids and the grandkids, and they all get their slice of the pie of the land. Should I put it in an LLC to make that easier? Or I've heard about trust, like going to ownership structure is like the first question that they ask because they ignored the goals aspect. But I'm going to throw it to the ownership structure expert over here about pros, cons, things to consider, and then I'll share some land ownership perspectives of things to consider with it.
Yeah, I agree. Like people are often wanting to look at ownership structure as the first thing, but if you're not very clear on your goals and also your values, then you're not going to have a good that's not a good place to start. I'll say that. Values are going to help you a lot in terms of ownership structure because then it'll help you see is it important to me to be fair, to be equal, or something else? You really have to like get clear on that because that's going to help you to determine what kind of structure we're looking at. So when I look at ownership structure from a legal perspective, is you can own property outright as your own individual self. You can own property in an entity. That entity can be owned by you individually or it can be owned by a group of people. And that entity might be an LLC, it might be a trust, it might be some other entity like a corporation, which is not as common, but it does happen. And then you might have other entities that you might consider as well. But when you're looking at individual ownership, when the property is in your name as an individual, that means that anything that happens with that property, anything that happens with you is all going to be the same. So if you unfortunately get into a car accident and someone sues you because they believe that you were at fault, that's going to put whatever property that you own at risk. So that's going to be anything from your house to the family farm if it's in your name or if a partial ownership interest is directly in your name. That's going to be to that bank account where someone added you as a joint account holder because they needed your help going to the bank. That's going to put their money at risk. Anything that your name is on directly is going to be a potential liability. And same with the other end. If something happens with your, let's say that you have family forest and it's in your name, that means that if somebody goes into the forest and gets shot by a hunter or they fall over a log and break their leg, then they're coming after your personal bank account because there is no separation between you as an individual and you as the owner of this property. So I always encourage people, let's separate that out. We don't want to have those liabilities mixed together. So that's where coming up with the LLC to hold real estate could be very helpful. And I'm not talking about just like your personal home, because if you put your personal home in an LLC, you might lose other things like tax exemptions that will be available to people who are people and not corporations or businesses. But things like rental properties or family properties or just any other property that you own that's not your personal residence, you might want to consider putting it into an LLC because that's going to separate that asset from you as an individual. It creates two separate entities, you who was always there, and then the entity that owns your land or your rental property or whatever other assets that you have that are not like your personal assets. So I always encourage people to try to separate personal from other ventures you may have. But then when it comes to your own legacy, when you're thinking about how do I pass property to the next generation, you might give it to them by will, which more than likely is going to be I give my three children either a shared interest in one piece of property or I'm going to give them each their own piece of property. You can do that through your will. But basically, what you're saying is, I'm creating this document. I'm saying who I want to get what. And after I die, I expect the person I named as executor to distribute the property in this will based on what I said it should be. I want this house to go to little Johnny. I want this car to go to little Susie. And I want this timberland to go to all three, all well, I said all three of them, both of them to be shared. That's what your will is going to do. It's going to be very specific, and then the property's transferred after you die directly into their names, more than likely. Doing something like a trust will allow you to avoid probate. It would allow you to transfer the assets outside of probate according to the terms of your trust. And in your trust, you could say property goes to them directly, or you could say it goes to them in trust, which means that there's a level of separation between the person owning the property outright versus someone else being the trustee over the property and managing it over their behalf. And I'm being very simplistic. There are other things you can do that are a little more complex, but I'm just being very high level. So don't go to your lawyer if you live outside of Georgia and say, well, Attorney McClendon said that these are my options. Because there are other options. I'm just giving you high level. And if you live in Georgia and you say, Attorney McClendon, thank you for being my lawyer. And I have these things I want to do. You said on your webinar, these are my options. I'm going to say, no, no, no. Let's look at your individual circumstance. So I said a lot of stuff, but basically what I want to say, and we could probably talk more about it, is that you got to think, do I want the property to go to a person as their individual selves, or do I want to pass it to them as an entity? Do I want to own certain property as an individual or as an entity? When you have an entity, not only can you create certain levels of protection, you also can put rules in place that would not be in place if people own property outright. So let's say that I leave my 100 acres to my 3 children outright, then they could do what they want to do with it. And they don't, if they want to do anything, they all have to agree. There's no like structure built in place that says this is how this property is going to be managed. But if I leave it to them in a trust or I leave it to them in an LLC, I get to say, I get to state the rules. I get to say, this is the person who's in charge. This is how decisions are going to be made. This is how you can use the property. This is how, if you want to live on it, these are the rules for living there. Or nobody can live on it, but you can receive income from it. Whatever the rules are, I get to put those things in place when I have when I leave property in an LLC or trust or some kind of a legal structure. I said a mouthful there.
You did. You did. It's a lot, but it's so complex sometimes, and which is why it's important to make sure you're talking to somebody. And so again, just as a reminder, like this is your umbrella, parameters of things to think about and at least have those conversations. But what I really loved what you said is about what is fair and what is equal. And fair does not always equal equal. And so many times, when it comes to land, we automatically assume, or at least I hear all the time of, I want to leave the land equally to everybody. And so they tend to do one of two things. Either everybody gets an equal share, right? So they're going to co-own it together, or they subdivide the property and everyone gets their own parcels. And there's definitely pros and cons to both. And so just a quick few things to think about and consider is if you're going to allow everybody to have a percentage of partial, whether it's through will or through an entity, as Veronica has already said, think about again those goals and objectives and be realistic about the family dynamics that is going to be inheriting it. Can they make decisions together? Can they make decisions together well? Um, I highly recommend, never doing a 50-50 split. Always do like a 51-49, have someone be dominant. And that's simply because when it comes to selling your timber or cost share, or whatever it might be, they both have to have their signatures on it if it's that, especially that 50-50 split. And so if they cannot agree, a lot of times that's where I've seen siblings especially come at a stalemate because there's somebody who doesn't agree, somebody who doesn't like it. I've seen it with families, usually families of three, but I've seen it with, siblings where, and it'll have nothing to do with the land. It'll be like, he stole my truck when I was 16 and took my, best friend over there and then wrecked it. And so they're mad about the truck from 20 years ago. And so they're not going to allow their sibling to cut the timber. completely unrelated, but weird sibling dynamics. And this is why we emphasize the goals and structures. I've also seen family dynamics where they get along really well. They have a strong trust, they have those strong understandings, they've had those conversations. And so that's why I want you to take those glasses off of being like, what are my goals? What makes sense? Okay. And how you want to pass things down. And fair warning too, sometimes subdividing the property, you think you may be helping, but again, depending on what their goals and values of what they want to get from the property, you could be kind of restricting their opportunities because the more you fragment the land, the less traditional management work you can do. So, say for example, you had 100 acres and you had two kids, right? You divided it equally because you wanted to be fair. You divide 50-50. They each have two kids. They want to be fair. So now all of those lands are 25, 25, 25, 25. They have two kids and they want to be fair. So now it's 12, 12, 12, 12, 12, okay? In traditional forest management, anything under 40 acres is a lot more challenging to get work done on. And so, in something that you thought you were handing over a gift, you've now handed them still a lot of value, but now it's much more of a challenge because something that they thought and they saw Granddaddy do, he harvested the timber on his 50 acres and then he replanted it and he had his food plot over there, right? Now you've only have 12 acres because you're that third generation that everyone wanted to be fair to, and they subdivided and subdivided and subdivided, and now you can't find anybody to come harvest your 12 acres because it's simply too small. And so what you wanted to do doesn't align with that. And so I'm not saying subdividing the property is wrong, but again, having those conversations with whoever is going to be taking over the property is those goals and values we talked about is going to help make that decision of do I keep it intact, do I subdivide it, or do we simply split ownership in one of these entities? Do you have anything else, Veronica, on that?
Yeah, I'll say that's where it's also so important to work with a professional, a land management professional, a legal management professional, a financial professional. All of those people can help you to come up with a comprehensive plan that anticipates these potential issues down the line. So one thing that you might even consider is you could set up an entity that holds and manages the land as a whole, but then you could still subdivide the land in a sense. Like you wouldn't do it as you might, where you actually like deeding off different parcels of the land, but you could subdivide it and keep the ownership within the LLC and then say, I'm going to assign a parcel to different people. And you can like make the rules up however you want. I'm not encouraging you to just make them up on your own, but working with a professional, we can make up rules that will help you to manage the land in a way that's collective, but then still
Mhm.
give each parcel owner like their or each family member their own level of control or decision making within certain bounds. Another thing I've seen that I think is really cool, where sometimes a family will have a large acreage and they'll keep a certain portion of it as open family land, and it might say this other portion of it is going to be available for subdivision if the family wants. So you might say this is the residential area of the family estate. And so within this part, we can subdivide up to maybe a half acre, depending on the requirements of your local government and your family's needs, but then the rest of the land is going to remain open. And so then within those sub parcels, you might have some ways of saying that this is how we're going to allocate them according to future generations, versus this open part, which we're going to keep managed as a whole. So there's a lot of flexibility, but these are things that happen when you plan. If you go with the default, which is when someone owns land, they die and it goes to their heirs, and then their heirs die and it goes to the next generation, there is no plan. And so all of these beautiful ideas kind of fall to the wayside because now you just have to figure out how you're going to manage this property and keep it going in the family. But having a plan, you get to like put all this in place in advance.
And that's a perfect segue. So, and again, remember, all of this comes down to your goals and values. Every one of these items you're going to bring right back up there because Veronica, you just shared a ton of options, a ton of ideas, a ton of flexibility, which is great and overwhelming all at the same time, right? But if you've set that solid foundation, it's gonna be more clear for you. And you've set that solid vision of values of what you want to accomplish, and you share that with those professionals. They're gonna narrow down that flexibility of like the world is my oyster to these steps, A, B, and C, are really a really good fit for you. How can we customize it, the a la carte version for you now at that point? So instead of looking at the entire alphabet, we've narrowed it down and now you're just tweaking it that best fits your situation, which is why I emphasize so much goals, values, vision. But point number three. So we did goals, values, we did ownership structure. That leads to decision makers, okay? Now you may be thinking decision making, like, isn't that kind of covered in ownership structure? Like, I've decided if I'm subdividing or not subdividing an LLC, blah, blah. But what we're referring to here is, and through all of this, we've decided you're keeping the property, right? Not selling it. But with the decision makers is who's like going to handle it. And I'm not just talking about an administrator, which I'll let Veronica talk about because that's legal jargon that's above my pay grade. But like who's going to be in charge of the property taxes? Who's in charge of the land management? So if there's multiple there, you again are being very specific, removing those rose-colored glasses of who's capable, who's willing, and who is in alignment with, what you want with your values and goals. And so, and willing and capable and available are not always going to be in that same person. In a perfect world of utopia, it would all fit in one person. The person who is willing would also be available and live nearby. But that's not always the case. Sometimes the local person wants nothing to do with it, and it's the long distance person that has those deep values that really cherishes and has an alignment with what you want. Sometimes, the long distance person, doesn't care as much. They're not willing. They may be available, but they're not willing. And sometimes the local person is willing, is local, but they're not necessarily available. Think of age, think of disability, think of, their season of life. People sometimes in a season of life, if they have young kids, it could be a temporarily unavailability. But say, for example, if they have a child with a disability, they may be willing, but they're not available depending on what that situation is for them, right? So there's a lot of dynamics in here, but you do need to be honest because this is the person who's going to quote unquote be in charge that you are kind of leaving everything to. And so you want to make sure, just like Veronica said, we are intentional with our plans. And so this is where you may say, oh, I still want to be fair. I love all my kids equally. And we're taking those emotions out of it. We're gonna look at this as business. Who is most capable based off of your goals that you want? Is it family heritage? Is it sibling relationships? Is it environmental stewardship, right? And you can have all three. You need to prioritize one though, because maybe the person who can ease the sibling relationship, he might not have as much of the environmental stewardship, but he can make sure that he's treating the others fairly, right? There's always that one, the peacemaker. He may not agree with it, but he knows how important this is for the family, and so he's not going to fight maybe what the siblings want. So you put him in charge because like he's going to do what's right for the family values. Maybe you have the bullhead because heritage is the most important thing to you. You don't want it sold to a development. You put the bullhead person in charge because they're going to be stubborn enough to make sure that family heritage stays there, right? So these are going to be hard decisions for you, but when you have that goal, you can make sure the property taxes, they're responsible enough to pay those property taxes. They're responsible enough to do the work and they have the same alignment with what your goal structure ultimately wants. So I'm going to throw it to Veronica for all the legal asset side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like Danielle said, if you have a single decision maker in many places, then that is going to you need to really decide like what kind of decisions you need them making and who's going to be the right person. And it kind of goes the same for if you are going to have multiple decision makers. So like Danielle said, it anytime you have that 50 50 decision making, you're going to run into some trouble. Or anytime that you require unanimous decision making, you're probably going to run into some trouble. But if you have a group of people that you would like to make decisions about the family property, then you need to just put some rules in place for how they make decisions. A lot of times when I work with families with heirs property, which if you don't know what heirs property is, it's family land or family real estate that's been passed down from one generation to the next in such a way that you have a lot of multiple family members owning the same piece of property. It could be three family members who inherited it, or after a few generations, you could end up with 100 people or more sometimes. But what we try to do is when we work with families to clear up a situation when there's been a few generations that have passed and now the ownership is shared amongst many different people, often of different generations, then we might have family, like a family board or a management team that will make decisions on behalf of the rest of the family. And then we have very clear voting mechanisms, just like if it was a corporation or some kind of a company. We're going to say, this is how many people have to be present at meetings for the meetings to be a valid meeting. This is how many people need to make the decisions in order for a decision to pass. This is what happens when there's a disagreement. This is the kind of documentation that we're going to require, keeping some kind of minutes so that everybody knows what was discussed from one meeting to the next. All of those things are things you can put in place if you're creating an entity, such as the LLC or a trust, to manage the family property. But if you are, again, if you're going to have multiple people making decisions, you need to have some very clear rules for how they make decisions. What happens if there's a disagreement? But if you do have a group, a management team, then you're going to make sure that you don't have it where, like, you're going to make sure it's like a majority type vote to where at least an odd number of people are there, and then the voting is done to where there's going to be a majority vote. But that's some ways that you can set up formal mechanisms for decision making, to make sure that when decisions are made, they're done in a structured, responsible way. Um, I also would say that you have to keep in mind, I think we're going to talk about it a little bit later when we get to tough conversations, but you have to keep in mind that everybody is looking at things differently. It's a little different when you're the parent and you have one piece of property and you're looking at how do I pass it to my children. But then there's another thing where everybody is like just coming into this from a, it's been a long history of family ownership, and now we're creating a new thing with creating an entity for our heirs property. People are going to have different levels of expectation, levels of involvement. Some people are going to feel like the older people are the ones in charge and the younger people need to shut up. And in some families, the younger people think they in charge because they got internet and they understand how to use Google, and then they think the older people need to shut up. And so, like, when we come to decision making, we really have to keep in mind that we're going to have intergenerational dynamics. We're going to have regional dynamics. We're going to have education level dynamics where someone who has gone to college and gotten a certain level of education, people who have not done that, have not chosen that route, they may feel as if there's like a power imbalance just from that standpoint. So there's a lot of different things that you need to think about, but it makes it a lot easier to think about them when you have people who have dealt with this a lot and can help you through that process.
Yes, 100%. And we'll definitely dive into that a little bit more with tough conversations. But I want to move into, so again, just as a recap, we set our goals and values. We understand which ownership structure, is best based off of that. We've identified who that decision maker is going to be. And then we have the financial and profitability plan. Now, this sounds really fancy, right? But those that filled out my survey, you all agreed that you wanted to make sure the land didn't become a burden. And that's one of the most common things I hear amongst everybody I work with, from, generational, third, fourth, fifth generational landowners to people who just purchased property. Their main thing is they want to make sure the land doesn't become a burden. When they say that, they mean a financial burden, right? Because we have our annual property taxes, and that's like a slow drain leak on your wallet depending on where your location is. But then you have any type of management work. Management costs money, okay? And so you can have visions and dreams all day long. However, if you don't have the budget to be able to afford to do it, the land's just going to sit there. And so what was a wonderful dream is now become either a burden, a nightmare, or even worse, just like something on the back burner that you've accidentally left the stove on too long and now is burning and frying and nobody cares about it, right? So that's what can happen if you don't have some type of financial plan. And again, we are removing emotions out of this because I know some people feel really strong of, oh, I don't want to make too much money from the land because that's greedy and that's wrong. And I completely disagree. In Matthew 25, the parable of the gold talents, it talks about the wisdom of good stewardship in multiplying your resources. And I look at that not as only as money, but also our land. We need to multiply our land to be able to help it thrive, not only for ourselves, but for the benefit of everybody else. If we can't, support ourselves, there's no way we can help anybody else. You have to be able to support the land for the land to be able to support itself moving forward. And that's going to go with your finances, which is a whole nother thing. But when it comes to a financial plan with the land, instead of just handing the land to the family and saying, good luck, this is when you can say, okay, we have a management plan. Management plans are guidelines. Nothing ever goes according to this plan, I promise you. However, you can't follow something and aim for a goal if you don't even know where those parameters of where you're trying to go are. And so that's what this management plan does, that if something was to happen to you tomorrow, they could pick it up and understand what were the steps you were trying to accomplish and how to get there. But you may be thinking, well, markets kind of suck right now, especially if you're in Georgia and the Southeast. Our mills have been kind of devastated. And so it's the elephant in the room, and it is true, it's terrible. So how do I make sure the land doesn't become a burden? This is when you can look at alternative revenues. There's a lot of different ways you can generate money, and sometimes you have to think just a little out of the box. First off, to actually get management work done, you can apply to cost share programs. You got your EQIP, you got your CSPs, you have your nonprofit cost share programs, do they pay for it to get done? No, not 100%. Can they help you get started and get that wheel turning? Yes, if you get accepted into them. So I always highly recommend getting into some type of, or at least applying to cost share programs, because that's going to help get the management wheel going. But as far as other alternative revenues, there's a lot of niche markets, right? If you're on the coast, you have palmetto berries. That's a huge market for leasing. Carbon markets right now are still a hot topic, and that's pretty much allowing the carbon internet world to pay you for your mature and growing trees. Now, the caveat is still they like managed forest, right? They don't want to take a tract of land that's maybe been there forever but is unhealthy because then it's not going to store or grow and absorb as much carbon as possible. They also have a few other requirements. It usually is down to acreage and significance. Each carbon market, despite what you might hear, has something that they're looking for to accomplish. Whether it is like maybe bottomland hardwoods that they're trying to preserve and conserve, or it is endangered species perhaps. And so they're looking at those longleaf pines or other, significant timber areas. Or maybe they're simply looking at longevity. And so they're looking at timber that is at least 80 years old, right? They want to create more of those redwood-like things. That's another ball game. But, those are options. Again, they're going to come with restrictions that you really need to think about through, but they can provide a revenue source. And so talking with your forester, now that you have your goals, your values, what the future of the land is going to do, they can help set up, here are some ways to generate some income streams. And it could be every single year, pine straw leases, hunting leases. They at least can pay your property taxes. Or it may be like hey, we're doing this, we're thinning on a 15-year rotation. So we're going to take out some timber every 15 years. Is it going to pay a lot? No, but you can take that income, throw it in a trust, and maybe that trust is going to pay the property taxes for that land for the next 15 years until that next thinning is available. There's a lot of different ways, and that's a conversation I've actually just had with some folks in Georgia, three brothers. They all have to decide and agree on everything I say. So I talk to one, he shares it with the other two. Then we all get on a group call together to talk about what I talked about, and then they make the decision. But they are now, and they've created their trust, and their goal was generational wealth because this was their grandma's land. So it was also from the 1800s because they're older. and they want to ensure that it goes to their grandkids, forever to generate revenue. And that's what there was important. So that's a lot of where these ideas recently are coming from. But Veronica, as far as financial profitability, I know I kind of dominated this part of the conversation right now. What are the legal aspects that you want to make sure they think about or consider in these conversations?
So the first thing I'm gonna say is that whenever I'm working with families who have land and they don't have anything going on, I'm gonna send you to somebody like Danielle or somebody, that is depending on what's going on with your land, it's gonna be some kind of an expert who can help you figure out how you can make some kind of money with your land. And the reason why I do that is basically just what Danielle said. You don't want to hand your family something that's unsustainable because they're less likely going to be willing to continue this legacy that you have. It's like mama thought it was a good idea for us to get these trees. And I've been very amazed. One, let me say it from this perspective. I'm from Atlanta. So I was not familiar with what's going on in the forestry world or the agricultural world until these past 10 years or so when I've been getting into this work. And just now that I'm exposed, I'm totally sold on it. But there are still people like me in Atlanta or New York or wherever they might be who just have no clue about what is possible with the land. And so here comes mom or dad with these grand ideas about, oh, y'all, this land is valuable. They got not making land anymore and all this good stuff. But it's like, basically, you're giving me something to pay property taxes for the rest of my life like you did. Like, I don't want that. And so I tell families, look, I can create a beautiful trust for you. It can have all these different management processes in there. We'll have the decision makers lined up. We're going to have distributions for everybody like, okay, this is your share of this property. This is what you get from this property. But if there's no money coming in, then it's you're basically telling your family, hey, I want you to get this trust and then put it in the shredder and just pretend like it doesn't exist because they're not going to want to manage property that has no income source because unless they have like grand ideas of their own, a lot of times families are like, this is more of a liability for us than it is a benefit. So having that money in there, that financial plan, it strengthens that trust or that LLC because it gives them more of an incentive to maintain it because they can see the value. They see you've already been bringing in money and they can see I can take this and I can make it go even further. That financial plan is like the foundation of it all, and it makes it more exciting because a lot of times I think like older generations they they value land because of what it means for the family. They can say, I remember my granddaddy working hard every day. It was just him and that mule pulling that plow every day, sun up, sun down, and they worked hard and they had to fight these people to keep the land. They're thinking about it from that perspective, but that doesn't pay the bills. So the next generation, they don't have that connection, and they're going to need something that gives them a connection to the land, and that financial and profitability plan is going to be very critical. And it just makes it like when I think of the possibilities, it's so exciting to me. I'm like, oh my gosh, you can do carpet, you can sell carpet credits, and then I don't know, Danielle, are you familiar with like I'm sure you are like farmers having their cattle and goats grazing in
Civil
the
pasture?
timber? Yeah, exactly. Yes. I
Mhm.
always thought that was such a cool thing because it keeps the cows cool and helps to maintain the undergrowth of the trees. Like I don't know how many people do that, but I think leasing to a farmer is something that people might consider as well.
Yeah, it's definitely a growing thing, especially amongst the more the homesteading. So it's like you thin out. So it has some caveats that if you have cleared land, you have to wait so long because otherwise your cattle will destroy your seedlings, right? So you kind of got to have a mature state, or you have to be willing to wait until after your first thinning because you need sunlight, because you need that understory, you need that grass, and you need the opening still. If they're too young, they either can't walk through it or they're going to destroy your seedlings. So everything you just invested is gone, but it is a growing practice. It's a neat way to kind of layer income streams, goals, all of those different assets. And I'm all about layering as many and diversifying. It's in Ecclesiastes, so I love it. What does it say? Invest in seven ventures, not eight, or no, eight. So
Hmm.
I'm all about some diversification, not putting all of your eggs into one basket. Um,
Hmm.
but so recap again. I'm all about some recap because I know we talk a lot. So, as a reminder of our umbrella goals and values, everything continuously coming back to this. Does it line up to your goals and values? Does it fit? Because that's going to make the ideas or the decisions clear, not easier, clearer. Okay. Because again, there's going to be a difference. It can still be tough and you can be emotional, but you'll understand that this is what needs to happen. Okay. Then we went through ownership structures, we went through decision makers, we talked about the finances, and now we're down to tough conversations, okay? And I'm going to be uploading the conversation starters again. And we're not going to go through this PDF, line by line with you. I just wanted you to have something you could take home and, start using some of these. And it's broken up into, warm up icebreakers. If you've never had a conversation around land, and especially around succession with land, because I know talking about basically when somebody dies is really weird. Like it feels distasteful, but you have to do it. So that's what those warm-up icebreakers are kind of like, let's just ease into some of these. And then I had things that, vision questions, stewardship responsibility prompts, legal planning. So it has questions for each of the criterias, those tiers that we talked about, they're not labeled the same, but they cover that same aspects. I even threw in there some what if prompts because we know everybody and their brother loves to talk about the what ifs. So, let's talk about the elephant in the room and let's just, get ahead of it. And there's some what if prompts for you to talk about because so often what is assumed, I've like, writing these questions the assumptions are in these questions. Everyone assumes, like so everybody knows what to do next. So those are prompts to help you. And then future vision prompts. A lot of these, in my opinion, line up into two kind of categories in which we've touched base on in each of the different sections. We've talked about long distance and local, and then generations. And those are really important to recognize when you're having these conversations. So if it's Thanksgiving or Christmas and everyone's at the table who wouldn't typically be at the table, this is a great time. But you do need to, again, we're taking off our rose-colored glasses and we need to be really honest with how are these dynamics like? So if you're long distance and local, if you have those two different people having these conversations, you're going to see things from a different perspective, okay? So when you are talking, when you ask these, you also need to remember to bring down your own defenses, is my biggest recommendation, okay? So don't go into this with your preconceived notions of what they're going to say, because that is the biggest way to basically put a halt. So these questions aren't going to solve everything for you. They're just there to open the door and allow you. And it may be something you have to do, over and over and over. Not that you need to ask the same question over and over again. That's just how to make people mad. But, like stepping into the door, asking these different questions, and then ideally, eventually, everyone will get on the same page, okay? And that's what's important here. Because when there is no communication, this is when everything is going to get thrown out the window. People are going to fight. Even when they say they're not going to fight, oh, I would never, they do. And they all fight about something dumb, like, the curtains on the window, let alone something important like land, right? So let's, have these. But when you do it, bring down your own defenses, have an open mind, and recognize that people see things from different perspectives. Long distance, local, generations, grandma, dad, kids, grandkids. You're probably not having these conversations with like the grandkids, like the 10-year-olds, but you could. And that could be a cool way to say, hey, what's your favorite part out on the property? What's your favorite thing about the farm? Right? I ask my kids that. I expect them to say the cows. Ray says the cows, that's for sure. But sometimes they'll say something completely random, like, oh, I just really love running on the hay bales, right? That is their favorite thing out here. I would probably, for like somebody else, it's probably something heritage rise, like with this house that I'm in right now that has no air conditioning. So I'm really hot right now because I don't want the fan to be blowing my hair everywhere. And then for, somebody else, the river view. The river view is gorgeous. I love it. There's nothing like it, right? So we got three different things going on, three different values. How I might manage, we'll just pretend hypothetically here. I was like, oh, I love that river view, right? I want to make sure I could envision like a nice little house on it, or perhaps like a vacation trailer. There is technically a trailer out there, but like building or fancying up, a nice little vacation spot out there. Everything I would do would be aligned to that spot, right? My kids would probably have 10,000 more hay bales out there. That's what would be important to them, is to ensure we have some type of hay production out there. Somebody else would be like, I really want to make sure we maintain the heritage of this house. How can we preserve what's at this house? And some of, the history with a lot of the old farm equipment. They're going to be making all the decisions around that scope. And so when we talk, and I'm not necessarily as part of these conversations, I'm using this as an example of how different generations might answer things. You need to kind of come with the open page of we have all these different values, right? And how can we just continue to communicate to make sure that the succession doesn't divide the family or gets passed down again according to however you want? Because right now, I'm assuming most of the people on here, you are in charge, right? So ultimately, you get the final say of how things are going to be done. But understanding of what was important to Granddaddy, why he did certain things, what's important to your kids, local, long distance, what's realistic, you're going to be able to work through the succession plan way more effectively. But Veronica, like what do you find is challenging with tough conversations? Because I know a lot of times it's the unspoken things for me, or people just saying, "Oh, I don't want to talk about that." I mean, I have 5 years working with widows whose husbands never talked to them about the land, and it was devastating to them because they had no idea what to do. Some of them got taken advantage of. Some of them sold the land out of fear and anxiety, or they just let it sit there and now it was becoming a financial burden that they were getting behind on their taxes. All because the husband assumed, maybe the son would take care of it, but something happened to the son. Or the son lives in Washington State and he's like not capable, not able. So a lot of lack of conversations throws a lot of people into a bind when they inherit the responsibility of the land.
Yeah, yeah. So it's definitely probably one of the more challenging things that when you are, especially if you are receiving from someone else or someone else is in charge. So I saw a question earlier in the chat where someone said, "What about if you have questions about your family land, but nobody wants to talk about it?" So you have that angle. You have the husband. Like I remember early in my career, I sat down with a couple and the husband was very adamant. My wife doesn't need a will. And she's like sitting there like, I'm actually wanting a will. And he's like, she doesn't need one. I have one and my will covers everything. And it was very hard, especially for me being a newer attorney in this arena. I didn't really know how to talk with him about that because he was very certain he was right. But now, after so many years of doing this and seeing how many people in that same predicament where the husband typically thought that he had everything covered with his will, he died. And then when the wife died, there was no plan because everything went to her just like the husband wanted. But then when she died, she had no written plan. And so I often it's a challenging conversation, especially with me for a long time and still to a large degree being quite a bit younger than the people I'm talking to. But I just try to bring it up like, I want to just give you this thing to think about. What do you think? And so I can share a horror story of when someone else was thought the same thing as that person and it actually didn't turn out to be right. And I can, try to ease my way in and say, so, what would you like to see? And would you be willing to hear me share with you ways that we can make sure what you want to do actually happens and that's in line with the law? So that's one thing that I do. I have to, I mean, from me being a lawyer, a lot of times I'll see the other person like, she's just telling you what I already told you, but since she's a lawyer, you'll listen to her. And sometimes that's just how it is, getting a outside person to share their insights. And sometimes people just not gonna talk either until they're ready. I had a situation where someone was very adamant that they didn't need a will, and then they got really sick all of a sudden, and they realized that if I don't have a will, then nothing's gonna be in place, and they got a will. Like there was no convincing. There was like, I mean, this person was like argue you down. I don't need a will, and then once that situation happened, it's like, hey, what do you think about that will now? Yeah, we need to go ahead and get that in place. So sometimes life just has to get people to that decision,
Hmm.
unfortunately. So that's one thing that sometimes you just gotta wait. You gotta be the patient one that waits until the right time. Um, One more thing I wanted to say about these tough conversations. I think there's an interview I listened to a few minutes ago or earlier today that helped me to think about it in a very clear way. He said, we're all going to die. And the fact that we're going to die is actually what makes life worth living. Because if we knew that we had all the time in the world, like we would be so lazy, we'd just be like, I'll get to it in 100 years, or I don't know. I really don't feel like, pursuing my purpose. I just want to like sit here and eat strawberries all day. Like we just would not have any sense of urgency. But the fact that we know that we're gonna die, we don't know when, but we know it's not gonna be 500 years from now. It puts a little fire under our tails to really live this life and do what we want to do in this life. And so I think that sometimes when people are hesitant to talk about this, to talk about death, it can be you indirectly reminding them that there is an end to this life that we have here on earth. And so if we want to make the most out of it, especially as it pertains to this family property, what would you like to see happen? Knowing that we don't have forever, but what vision can I help you carry out? How can I support you in carrying out your vision for this property? Sometimes that could be a way to get the conversation going by asking the person, how can you support what they're wanting to do? And perhaps that might help them to feel more inclined to talk because they're not feeling like you're forcing them to make a decision, but you're actually helping them to do what they want to do and reminding them that I don't have all day to get this done. This is something that I need to start taking action on today if I want it to be meaningful.
Yeah. When I worked with widows, and of course I talk mostly to husbands in the forestry world, and they'd be like, ah, she knows what to do. I'm like, well, but does she? And they usually would say, oh, well, my son would help him. And I said, well, what if he's in the car with you? And he is like, well, she knows Jerry. Jerry would help her. She knows that he's a forester. I said, he's with you. It's a boys hunting camp. And you get hit by a truck on the way down there, right? All three of you gone. Does she know what to do? And then it gets him thinking. And so a lot of times, and you don't have to be as crash or crude as that, because honestly, it probably won't come off as well. Family just gets really weird whenever you start talking about that stuff versus a third party person. Like, so me being an ex person, not have any type of um what's the line? Um, I've
Like dog in a fight.
no dog in the fight, right? So it doesn't matter what happens to that land to me because ultimately I'm not getting it. A lot of times I've noticed with family, if they're not willing to talk, it's a lot of times they perceive it as greed almost or rudeness. Like they don't want to cause that family fight if you find out that your brother's going to get the property, right? And they're afraid how you are going to handle it or how your brother's going to handle it if he finds out you get the property, right? They're like, oh, well, I'm just not going to talk about it, and that way we can ease those, relationships. But again, kind of being upfront, and those conversation starters are ways not to beat around the bush, but you're just kind of tipping your toe in, and they kind of increase more so in intensity, like in those weeds, like the legal prompts, those are more of those weed questions. Probably don't start with those, I would say, if they're unwilling to talk about it. Talk about, more of the hopeful side of the succession, right? Talk about the optimism side. You want to remove any of those ideas that you were being greedy. And that's also something we are going to have to place a mirror in front of our own selves. We think we have good intentions, but sometimes it is because we're hoping we inherit it, right? Like that's what we want to hear. And then when we don't hear it, are we able to handle that type of responsibility? So again, quick little story. I got my dad's will, and this was like 10 years ago. And I'm the oldest of two. I'm the responsible one, quote unquote, right? And so I assumed I would be his like executor and medical decision maker, administrator, blah blah. And I found out my sister was. I'm not gonna lie, my knee-jerk reaction was a little offended that he picked her over me. Which was, and I never brought it up to him because I recognized, I mean, it took me like a sleep on it, but I recognized that was the wrong attitude to have. Ultimately, it's his decision. If he wants her for whatever reason, that's fine. And I think it had more to do with distance. Like she lived closer to him. And so once I was more honest about it, I had a baby, I had a toddler and a baby at this point or something like that. So I had a growing young family. She has no kids. It makes logistical sense why he would pick her. She lives closer, she has no kids. I have a new baby, I live further away. It just makes sense, right? She'd be able to get there to the ER to make that decision in like 20 minutes. It would take me 3.5 hours. That's a lot of time. But my knee-jerk reaction showed my expectations. And so this would also be something I would highly recommend when it comes to family who doesn't want to talk about it. Make sure you're prepared to hear answers you don't necessarily like or expect. Because if you go in it with that knee-jerk reaction or that mindset of expectations and it doesn't play out that way, it's not going to help. So that's why I like to start with the optimistic side, the hopeful side, like tiptoe your way in there. As as far as how can you find out what your proper or what your family owns in terms of land, depending on where you're at, because I know I'm talking to KB right here, you can look up your family property on tax assessors. All property is public record, so you can look up your family name. And assuming that it is in the right family name, right? Sometimes people don't pass down property appropriately. And so it can be a little messy, but that could be a way that you could step into and be like, I don't actually know how much land we have. I know it is in we'll just use my county in Brunswick. I know it's in Clinton County. I have no idea how much it is. I know my daddy's last name. I'm gonna go look it up. You can do some of that. And you might find out he has like four other parcels, right? And so again, not that you're gonna throw it and be like, what are all these rental properties you never told me about? Like that's not how we're going to approach it. But you can start kind of, preparing for, oh, it's a lot more than I thought, or it's a lot less than I thought, perhaps. Perhaps he's been selling property to remove family tensions and family fighting, right? I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but perhaps that's what happens. So that's a one way, at least property wise, you can look for what your family owns. And if you're like, I have no idea where they own it, how much they own it, that's going to be a lot harder dog to fight, and you're definitely just going to have those conversations.
Yeah, and I want to say with that, one way I always tell people to do is to say, "Hey, I went on this webinar and they were talking about these great ideas, and I just wanted to see, do you know anything about our family land?" So using either me or Danielle, I have a YouTube channel that I put a lot of stuff on there. Sometimes it's pulling something like that as a conversation starter. It's saying, "Hey, this attorney, she was online talking about family land and different things," and I just was wondering if you'd be willing to talk with me about our family land. I heard we had some land and I just wanted to know more, kind of just asking questions, sometimes acting a little bit more ignorant than you might be. Like, do we have anything? And knowing that you heard about 100 acres somewhere, but it might just be that you, play it cool until you can get the information that you need to help you to feel confident in that answer. But yeah, like what Danielle said is a way that you can do it. But sometimes you might have to ask somebody, and ways you can do that is by referencing something you heard about and see what they think about it and maybe start it there.
And I know that there was one other question in here about finding professionals, attorneys and accountants who are well versed in succession planning and getting landowners to start thinking about this topic. Finding professionals, depending on what state you're in, Jen, I think you had to jump off. You're in Virginia. Okay, so I would not be able to help you. Veronica would not be able to help you. However, in Virginia, trying to find, and Veronica, maybe you have better tips of trying to find estate planning lawyers who not only are well versed in succession planning, but land succession planning, right? Because sometimes they can be real versed in succession and rental properties and stock portfolios. That's one animal. Land is a completely different animal. But you can maybe look up, local succession planning people near me, and see what that list looks like. Trying to find recommendations like in your landowner network or your local forestry network is probably one that I would recommend first, because not only are they going to be lawyers who are used to land, they're hopefully going to be good ones who've worked with these other folks and help them see through what they're looking for. But Veronica, do you have tips for estate planning lawyers on how to find them?
Yeah, I think that the affinity groups is probably like the best way, going into groups that you're a part of, from like land management, forestry management, and seeing who they recommend. But then also you can like start with a professional in a particular state. So for example, me being in Georgia, I know attorneys all over the country who do what I do. And so I have my own list. So sometimes it could be just reaching out to me, or I don't know if Danielle, if you have people in other parts of the country that you can refer to. But sometimes we might know of someone.
Personally, I help with foresters and land sales agents. Connecting with lawyers, not my forte. But that is all the questions I have. Veronica, do you have any last words you want to share before we open up to any Q&A?
I'm sorry, I'm having a few technical difficulties with my technology.
No, you're okay. I was just asking if there was any last words you wanted to share before I open it up for any Q&A. For if anyone wants to jump on live, you can unmute yourself or you can just type it in the chat and we'll make sure to answer your question right now, whichever one you prefer. I think she's still having tech issues. Okay.
Okay, I'm back now. Sorry.
Okay. Do you have any last words?
No, I think that we had a really great conversation. Oh, what I will say, it's kind of a plug. I'm gonna be doing another webinar Sunday evening. I usually do a monthly webinar the fourth Sunday of the month. I forgot we had 5 Sundays this month, and so I forgot last week, but we'll be doing it this upcoming Sunday, where we'll be continuing this conversation from a legal perspective, going a little more in depth on estate planning and things like that. And so, if you don't mind, I'll share the link to register to that in the chat, and would love to would love to have others to join that so we can continue that conversation. Um,
Yes, please put it in the chat box and also email it to me, and I can make sure to put it in the replay video. So while she's doing that, does anyone have any questions you want to ask us while we are live with you right now, and we can give our best answers to the best of our ability? As you've seen today, it is complex, and the answer usually is it depends because there's so many different layers to it. But hopefully, this gave you a really good umbrella, really good parameters and frameworks to start working within to get you to that ideal succession plan and thinking about how you might want to navigate and do things. But